Hello, thank you so much for joining our webinar, New E-Learning Measurements, the Challenges and Advantages Facing Your Business, hosted by Senior Vice President of Assessment Solutions at Smarterer, Larry Israelite. I'm Lindsay Locke from Pluralsight, and I'd like to take a minute to tell you what to expect during this presentation. First, I'd like to draw your attention to the chat box in your webinar control panel. Larry will be answering questions, so please submit your questions through the chat box during the presentation. Be sure to tweet about your experience today with our hashtag PluralsightLive, as we'll be choosing a winner at random for a free month of training with Pluralsight. After you exit our webinar, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. We'd love to hear from you, so please take a few moments to complete it. This webinar will be recorded, and we'll email the link in a few days. And with that, thank you for joining us. Let's welcome Larry.
Hi, everybody. How are you today? We are coming to you today from sunny Boston, where it's 75 degrees and sunny. At least that's what we're telling ourselves as the snow has started once again. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm glad you were able to join me in this, what I hope will be a discussion. Now, we are using webinar technology. Your voice is muted, but please do submit questions and comments. And then throughout the presentation, I've embedded some survey questions for you so you can express your opinions as we go. And as you want to make comments, please make them in writing, and we'll talk about them as we can. You can read my bio. It was, in fact, a small chicken farm. It was in a place called Upper Black Eddy, Pennsylvania. And I have spent more time than I care to think about working in corporate learning and development environments, also a few years in a consulting firm. But the goal was always to change, which was to figure out how we can make better business through learning. And as many of you know, that's a very easy question to ask and a very difficult question to answer. And I hope that during this presentation, we can get you one small step closer to thinking about how you might be able to achieve a goal like that. I work for a company called Smarterer, which provides a very interesting, very exciting assessment tool that can help you or people in your organizations measure their skills and get accurate, valid results in as few as 10 questions and in as short amount of time as 2 minutes. We are relatively new to the Pluralsight family, having been acquired towards the end of last year. And we are, in fact, trying to figure out how to both measure what skills you have and then help you improve them by using the learning assets that Pluralsight has. So we're very excited to be part of the family, and as I said earlier, even more excited today to be doing this presentation. By way of setup here, this presentation is all about learning. All of us, every day, probably more than once, encounter situations where we could be more effective or more successful if we knew one more thing, if we had a little bit more skill, if we could solve the particular problem. And learning is a way to get there. And so the focus today is going to be on how we do two things, how we can help individuals learn more and retain more and get more value from the training in which they participate. And just as important, how we can help organizations figure out whether or not they're getting the value they need from the investments they are making and their employees are making in learning and development. So we're going to look at both sides of this equation, individual organization in order to yield better learning and then therefore business outcomes. But I want to start today with a couple of little questions so we can understand a little bit about who's on the phone. And the first one is just who you are, or more importantly, what's your work situation? Are you a consultant or a freelancer? Or do you work for a company or some combination of those or some other combination that we don't know about? So on your screen, you can answer the question. We will pause for a moment while we wait. We would like to get 75% of the responses. So far, 57 of you have responded. Now we're up to the 80s, closing in on the 90s. We're almost there. Wait another second or two, but I can tell you by the results, you are overwhelmingly involved in organizations by almost 85%. And then the second question, which is more designed just to help you understand what you do there. Simple question, do you work in a learning and development organization? Do you have some part of your official or unofficial responsibilities related to training and development? Or are you working more in the business doing the good work that every company requires? Up to almost 50 responses. You're getting this question stuff down pretty well. That's good because there are lots more questions to come. And they are very helpful to us as we go in the presentation to sort of shape things and to find out what you're thinking. And this is interesting. We are almost evenly divided, 58%. In fact, we have 58% to 42%. So many of you work in learning and development organizations, but many of you have other responsibilities. So that's good. We can get some good dialogue going about how the different ideas presented here resonate with people who have different backgrounds and different perspectives. So with that, I'm going to move into the content of the presentation. And by way of introduction, we're going to talk about two different topics here. One is focused on individuals, as I mentioned earlier, about how you can maximize learning. And I'm going to talk for a couple of seconds about some interesting research that challenges us in that regard, and then some ways to overcome that. And then towards the second half of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how both individuals and organizations can measure effectiveness and propose that the way we have done this for the past 40 years or even longer may not be appropriate in the environment in which we are working today, and propose a different approach. Not radically different, but a slightly different approach to how we can think about measuring effectiveness. So this fellow, I love this picture. His name is Hermann Ebbinghaus. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he did some very interesting research on learning. And more importantly, he did research on forgetting. And it does have a significant influence, I think, even today, on how we should think about the value we get individually from training we participate in and learning that might derive from that. So let me present a little bit about what Ebbinghaus said. He created a concept called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And it's fairly simple. What it describes is the amount of information we retain as we move further away from some training event or some learning event. And we could probably spend a long time talking about the difference. We won't do that today. And so that begins with the theory that when you attend some training event or you learn something, for a moment, you retain 100% of it. Now, I know from personal experience, I should mention, by the way, that I was really happy to see this because I experience this on a daily basis, and I thought it was just me, so it's nice to know that it's science. So many of you might actually have that same experience, that what's happening with how much you remember is actually a function of psychology and not so much of any particular personal issue you might have. But we start out, we remember 100%, and then time occurs. And as the distance from the learning activity increases, the amount we actually remember or the amount we forget decreases or increases accordingly. And so I'm going to start with a poll, a little question for you to answer, which is, how long do you think it takes for your retention rate to drop to 58%? So what's the amount of time that occurs between the 100% and the 58%? So same drill. Here are the options. Is it 30 minutes? Is it an hour? Is it 4 hours? Is it a day? Or is it a week? Up to about 50 responses. Up to almost 100. Got about 125 people on the call, so wait for another couple seconds for the last 20 people to contribute. And as I share the results, it's very interesting. Here are the results. The winner, by a fair amount, is 1 day. A few of you picked 30 minutes, a few of you picked an hour, increasing up to 4 hours, and only a few thought it was a week. And I have to admit that when I saw this, I was sort of shocked and happy. Because in fact, according to Ebbinghaus, you lose 50 or 42% of learning within the first 20 minutes. And then you can see as you go by, down to 40% after an hour, 44%, 36% after 9 hours. And by the time a month goes by, you retain only 21%. Now, I know when I attend training, I'm all enthusiastic and excited and sort of reveling in how much I learned. And then I'll kind of walk away and go back to the job, and suddenly things that were incredibly clear to me in the moment have become a little more foggy. And the longer I go, the worse it gets. As I said, it turns out that this is a pretty common thing. Now, my point is not to argue in 2015 whether or not these numbers that Ebbinghaus discovered in the early 1900s are exactly accurate. But I think the conclusion we can draw from it is we do tend to forget more than we realize as we walk away from an event that's focused on learning and walk back to the complexities of our everyday jobs and all of the stimuli with which we have to deal on a daily basis, on an hourly basis almost. So the question is, if this is roughly what our reality represents, and I should mention, if you have a comment or question about this, by all means enter it into the chat line, because this is the kind of thing that I think would be interesting to see if this kind of resonates with you. Is this the experience you have, or is this totally surprising to you? But the point is, what we need to do then is figure out how we can put in place some processes to overcome this relatively dramatic degradation in learning and find ways to go back up the learning curve. So what can we do to decrease the rate of attrition, or I should say increase the rate of retention for learning experiences in which we participate, and even more importantly, that we create, so that the people who attend those learning experiences have a greater likelihood of retaining more information longer. And so what I'll offer to you here is a couple of ideas. So the first is a concept called spaced repetition or review. And the idea is relatively simple. And once again, it makes intuitive sense, but we don't always take the time to do something about it. So what I'd suggest is that we can plan these things in intervals, a day, a week, and a month. And you can change those intervals, and you can change the things you do. But I would offer that if you follow these kind of relatively concrete steps, they'll help increase retention. I've just encountered a technology problem. Okay, we're back. So first, no, I'm okay. So there are a couple of questions. So I'll pause for a moment, then respond to them. So the first one is, I prefer training in videos like Pluralsight. Is the research that shows which method is faster to learn? So I'm going to answer that question with a slight equivocation, meaning that you can find almost any research that will give you whatever result you want. You just have to look for it. But my own experience has been that generally speaking, I'll use the term e-learning in general, but I'll expand it to be automated learning, perhaps is a better way to look at it, tends to result in faster learning than more traditional classroom methodologies. And the people who are doing learning games will say this, and the people who are doing traditionally learning will say this. And the numbers range anywhere from 30% faster to 75% faster, depending on the people, the goals, the methodology, and the study. So generally speaking, it is much faster using mediated learning technologies than more traditional classroom learning technologies. And there's another question about whether or not the shorter attention spans and the multiple distractions of the 21st century have shortened this dramatically. And that's a really interesting question. I just read yesterday sort of what was a definitive conclusion about multitasking. Because, as everyone knows, I don't know what initials they're using these days, but millennials and X's and Y's and all the sort of the people who are, I'd say, under the age of 35 or even 40, claim to be incredibly effective when they multitask. And I have yet to see research that says people can multitask effectively. And in fact, what I read yesterday was that not only is it not effective, but it's actually worse. So you're doing more things and retaining less and focusing less than when you were just focused on one thing. And then, so I think that we're seeing probably this is worse because people are doing so many things that they're not really able to focus as much on the one thing they're trying to learn, so they retain less of it going in. So if you only retained 80%, if you only got 80% in the beginning, then the degradation would be faster. Then another great question is what is mediated learning? And what I mean by that, and it's probably a bad choice of terms in this context, is everything that falls into the general genre of e-learning. So web-based learning, learning games, things that are not traditional instructor-led, whether they be live in a classroom or something like this using virtual classroom technology. So I could have substituted e-learning there, and then you can think of all the variations of e-learning. And even within that, some people would say that simulations are faster than more traditionally learning. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I suspect where I started, you can find research to say anything is faster, but probably in general, the category of e-learning results in leads to faster outcomes than more traditional methodologies. So now we're going to go back to this concept of spaced repetition and review. And while I cover this in the context of Pluralsight courses, it's not limited at all to Pluralsight courses. And I'll just use an example in a second of how this might work. But the first thing, you've gone to learning. You have come back. It's a day later. And you want to review to make sure that you retain the content. So one thing you might do is look at the results of any kind of embedded learning checks in any course that you might have taken or any test results that you had. And look at the areas in which you did not do as well as you might have. And you can define that for yourself. And go back and look at the sections of the content that directly focus on the areas in which you could improve. Just review some content. It's pretty simple. And will that get you back up to 100%? Probably not. Will it move you up from the 58% or the 40%, the 44%? For sure. Now, you could choose to do that every day for a week, and that's a personal choice that you make. But then let's look at what happens in a week. So in theory, and I'll talk about this in a second, you took training, and then you went and did something. You did real work. And as you began to do your real work, and I should mention that this relates to training that's associated with job tasks you perform on a regular basis. It's harder when it's enrichment, that things that are not related to your work. So we'll assume for a second that we're talking about content related to the work that you do. Look at your work tasks or job assignments and ask yourself a simple question. Was there content in the learning that I just took a week earlier that directly bears on the work I have to do? And if the answer to that question is yes, you go back to that learning content and you review those sections. You might go through them completely. You might take the learning checks that are associated with them. You might simply review a summary that might be in a course somewhere. But the idea is now connect it directly to work that you're doing. And go back and do the work based on, improved because you've now gone back to a week earlier and reviewed content that you picked up then. And then finally, and in some ways this is the most difficult for reasons I'll explain in a second, get manager and or peer feedback and your own personal observations about how effective you're being in doing your work. So what I'm talking about here is conducting what I might describe as little after-action reviews, kind of like they do in project management. Look at what's going well and what's not going well, and based on that, go back and review the content that was associated with the things you were doing that you were not doing as successfully, as effectively, as quickly, or as well as you thought you should be based on the training you received. So this notion of spaced repetition and review can help you spin back through the learning experience, not the entire learning experience, but small pieces of it that directly bear on either a test you took or a learning check that you completed, on specific work tasks or job assignments that relate to the content of the training, or after a little more time has gone by, what you're doing well and what you're not doing well, and how you could go back to that learning experience and find content that can help address those issues. Now, we have a question about, does the Fouquetting curve include learning events that included some sort of assessment? And the answer is no. The research he did was, in some sense, now bear in mind, this was the early 1900s. There wasn't much mediated learning. There really wasn't much assessment at that level in those days. It was more about memory and how quickly things move out of memory into kind of, in my case, oblivion. But it was a little more pure research than that. So one model for this is spaced repetition review. And now I'm going to go to something a little different but not unrelated. And it's a concept called reflection. And this is connected to the idea of the after-action review that I mentioned a moment, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I contend that when we go to training or engage in some learning event, we think this happens. We think we go to training and we learn. And in some ways, our entire universe is based on this model. And I am here today to tell you that I don't believe that. I think you go to training and you might learn something. And if we factor Ebbinghaus into this model, you go to training and you might have learned stuff, and then sort of the next day, a lot of it's gone. And so the question that I posed earlier was, what can we do to help make this more the case? And I'm going to propose something slightly different, which says that this is really what happens. We go to some training, then we go do work. And if we add two more steps to this model, which is we go to do work, and then we periodically pause consciously and reflect on the work we've done and take a real objective, hard look at what we've done well and what we have not done so well and ways in which we can improve, and then we review content related to those things. Then what happens is this, I claim. We build a virtuous loop in which we go to training, we do, we reflect, we review, then we learn, and then we start the cycle over again. And that really the learning process, or the way we maximize the value of training we receive, is by being conscious about this do, reflect, review, learn loop. Because very often what happens is, and I have lots of examples of this in my life, and one of them goes back to a long time ago. We're talking about someone we worked with, and the comment about this person was that he didn't have 10 years of experience. He had 1 year of experience 10 times because he never learned anything, never improved his skills, never modified behavior based on experiences that he had. And so he had more of the training, the presumption that training and learning happened, when in fact those who knew him well, those with whom he worked, could see that nothing ever changed. And that what he needed to do was engage more in this reflection loop to do work, and say, what's happening with it? What am I doing well and what am I not doing well? And so I would argue that another way to overcome our tendency to forget is to consciously engage in this virtuous loop. Now, it's hard. And it's hard because you have to be really honest with yourself and ask yourself the hard questions. And what I mean by the hard questions is you have to be willing to say, what am I messing up? Where are the things that, what are the things I'm doing, the work I'm producing, the relationships in which I'm trying to engage, the outcomes I'm trying to achieve, what are those that are not coming out as good or successfully as I'd wanted? And be willing to listen to the answers. Sometimes those answers come from your own head. But sometimes if you do this small after-action reviews with your colleagues, with your manager, you'll get information from them. So I say go find a friend who's willing to engage in that kind of conversation with you and be open to learning from the feedback. And I think the hardest item on this list is the last one. It's very hard to listen to less than positive comments about the work we do and to really act on them. Our reflex is to be defensive. Our reflex is to point out all the reasons why the issues that we're talking about were out of your control. And as someone who's a master at doing that, I can tell you that if you just let go a little, if you just say, maybe I'm not perfect, maybe there are some things I could do better, it opens up this entire world of learning possibilities that you sort of have masked off before. And I think that by just engaging this frequently enough, it becomes a habit. You know, there's a great book you could go read called The Power of Habits, written by a guy named Charles Duhigg, who is a New York Times reporter, and he talks about the way habits are formed and the way they're maintained. And I think that building a habit around small after-action reviews and learning from the outcome of that is a very successful, effective way of beginning to counteract what our brains naturally create for us, which is, in my case, the more that gets stuffed in, the more it dribbles out the other side. So any comments or questions, you can feel free to chat them up and we'll talk about them. But while we're doing that, I just want to point out how this connects to content like the type that Pluralsight offers. This is the table of contents from one of their courses, Python Beyond the Basics. And when I say go back and review things that are relevant, the structure of the course itself, topics, the modules in this case, the video clips, you can hone in on something very specific. So in the case of the second phase of the review cycle, if you know over the next couple of days you're doing some Python programming and you're going to do some of the things that are inside the module strings and representations, you could look at the whole thing, which is 18 minutes and 45 seconds. But you could say, I just need to work on this thing called reprib, which, by the way, I don't understand this at all. But I'm guessing that's a topic that will be relevant to someone who does Python coding. You could just go look at that one module to review that content and then go try it. So you're both reviewing a week later, but then you have this little do, reflect, review, and learn model going at the same time. So this is how you can take content like Pluralsight's and apply it inside of either of the models that I mentioned. We have a couple of other questions. The author of the book on habits was Charles Duhigg, D-U-H-I-G. I'll just comment once about that book. It's one of these books where I sat down and read the whole thing in one sitting because it was so interesting. And it was particularly attractive to me. I'll tell you one little anecdote from it. He's a reporter of the New York Times, and he would sit in his office, and every day at 3 o'clock he'd go to the cafeteria to get a cookie. Now, that turned out that he was trying to manage his weight, and he wanted to not have the cookie. And as he got into the work related to this, it turns out that why he went to the cafeteria was not to get a cookie at all. It was to go meet with people who would be there. And so we found out the motivation for going there had nothing to do with the cookie at all and was much more about socializing with other reporters to learn more about what they were doing and what was happening in the paper and in the world. So he just substituted another way to interact with people at that point in his day, and he was able to stop eating the cookies completely. So it's more about analyzing why you do things as opposed to assuming that you know. Second thing, someone else has said another advice, some more advice to enhance learning is to try to teach somebody else. And that way you'll be able to learn more in order to solve questions the learner has, et cetera. Great suggestion. It's one of the things that teaching other people forces you to do is become very conversant with the content in a way that you might not be if you're just thinking about yourself. So I think it's a great suggestion. Another question is, would I suggest peer review of my design? And I'm not sure what you mean by that question, except if you're asking if I'm creating a learning experience, I'm designing something, and I spent, I was a designer for a long time. The more people review your design, the better it's going to get. So I always say yes to that question. Another question about how does this relate to really long courses, which are difficult to complete in a short amount of time. That's one of the problems with really long courses. And I think what you have to do in that case is try to break it out into some meaningful chunks that you can, I'll say it differently. Break the content into chunks that have meaning to you in your work context, and try to organize your thoughts that way. And then the last question, which is a great question. These have all been good questions, but this one resonates with me. What do you do if employees have to take multiple trainings within a very short time period? And I guess I'd have two different perspectives. On one hand, if you're so in a moment we're going to talk about how the corporate world is changing. So this may be old school, in which case I apologize, but I think it works with a slight variant in the newer school way. If you're a manager and people are going to training and they're going to multiple trainings within a short period of time, try to do a work plan before they go about how they can apply what they're learning back on the job. So give them specific things to focus on that connect their work to their training in a way that sets them up for success going in, and then do the same thing when they come back, which is talk to them about it. Okay, you took these 4 courses. Let's talk about how you're going to apply each of them in your work in some defined time period. And I think that the more planful you can be and the more specific you can be, the more likely you'll help increase retention to the extent you can. And I think even if you're doing this yourself, even if you are taking training on your own, doing a little forethought about how it connects to the world you live in will increase the likelihood that you'll retain more given sort of the challenges you face going in. So I'm going to sort of end that section by saying that in the same sense that I think we're suffering from sensory overload in general, with all of the information we're bombarded with on a regular basis, when people go to training, sometimes they feel the same way. And the more we can do to structure that experience and to prepare them in some meaningful way to have strategies for increasing the likelihood that there's a connection between what they're learning and what they're doing every day, the more likely you are to have better individual learning outcomes. And I'll do this transition by saying the first half of this was focused on individual learning outcomes, and the second is focused on something different, which is how do organizations measure, monitor, and judge learning effectiveness? And so now I'm going to start with a couple poll questions for you, just to find a little bit more about where you work and what you do there. So first statement, I feel like saying this and I'll pound my fist on the table at the end. My organization formally measures the quality of the training it offers. And that's just to agree to, strongly agree to disagree, not our strongly disagree scale. We've got about 40, up to 60. You guys are great responders. I give you all A's in respondability. almost up to 100. Want to get another 30 of you to go? Okay, so we're good over 100. Let's look and see what we get. We have an interesting distribution. More than half more than half are disagree or strongly disagree. Only 2% strongly agree, so only 25% of you think your organization actually does it. And I guess I'm a little surprised by that, but here's the really big question. No fist pound on this. I'm really curious about it. Information about the quality of past training is used to make decisions about future training. So if you were an organization in which they measure, do they do anything with the data? And it's okay if you said your organization doesn't do it in the last one to skip this question. So we're getting there. 84, 87, almost at 100. So in the interest of time, I'm going to, we're okay. Results here. And so this is good. So slightly over, almost 40% of you said your organization does actually use information. And I would say that's pretty good. It's unfortunate that the other 33%, another 33% said they don't. But that is an interesting dilemma about whether or not, for all the effort that goes into collecting data, whether or not it actually serves any purpose in organizations. And we'll talk for a little bit about why this might be the case. So first, so as I mentioned when we started, I've been working in learning and development. I didn't actually mention the number, but it's over 30 years. And I would say that more than ever before, and I guess I should mention that during that time, every 18 months, there was some revolution in learning. It amused me for the first 10 years, confused me for the next 10 years, and depressed me for the rest of the time. So I got tired of hearing about it. But what is the case, and I say this for the first time, what is the case is things are really different now. When I started in this business, there was management control of everything related to learning and development, and I think now that you are taking a lot more control. Learners are taking more control. There's more democratization in a sense, which is what Pluralsight's all about, of the learning function and of learning in general. There weren't many choices. You kind of had what the company offered and you lived with it, and now there's so many choices that makes your head spin. It's nuts out there, in a good way. Oversight was pretty simple. You had a training catalog, you sent out things to people, they signed up and they went. And now oversight is much more complicated because companies offer training, departments offer training. You can go on the internet and find almost anything you could possibly want. And nobody, other than you maybe, knows everything you're doing. The vendor community was pretty small, and now the vendor community is huge. And finally, and this is the one that to me is actually the most interesting. In the past, employers owned all the data related to your training and development. And now I'm not so sure. Now I think there's a lot of data that you own yourself. When you complete Pluralsight courses, your company never even knows about it. And so if we look down the right-hand side of this column and we say, in an environment in which there's learner control, many choices, complex oversight, large vendor community, and employee-owned data, how do we evaluate the effectiveness organizationally of learning? And that's what we're going to talk about for a moment here. Now, for those of you that have been in the learning space for a number of years, you have heard of Donald Kirkpatrick. In 1994, he published what was a seminal book in its time on learning evaluation in organizations. I'll go through this quickly. You probably know all this stuff, but there were 4 levels. Your reaction, did you like it? We used to affectionately refer to these things as smiley sheets. There was a backlash against them for a while, but my contention has always been that if you don't like the learning experience, the likelihood that you will learn from it greatly diminishes. So I think this is important, but it's not the only thing. And what happened was organizations focus just on this and nothing else. Then there's a second question. Did you learn anything? And this would have been some kind of traditional test model. Maybe not completely traditional, but is there some way to measure whether or not the objectives of the learning experience were achieved? Third, and I would say that in some organizations this happened. The third one, not so much. Behavior. Did your behavior change? So if you went to training, you in theory learned something, you then went back to your job, did you do anything differently than you did before you left? And this is pretty tough because this had to be some sort of job observation or manager opinion or feedback from your peers. And those things are very complex, fairly labor intensive, and pretty otherwise challenging to do. And then finally, were there business results? So this is the hardest one, meaning I as an organization, invested in a learning intervention. I built or bought something. I delivered it. I had people come off the job to take it. I spent a bunch of money. Did I get anything for it? And even fewer organizations did that. And the question is, even in the old days, when it was invented in '94 and maybe up until 2000, did it really work? And I would say, based on my experience, 33% of it worked. We were never terribly effective at implementing the third and fourth levels of Kirkpatrick's model. And I think there are a lot of people that were frustrated by it. And lately, the executives have been asking training organizations to justify their existence by delivering data that proves that there was business impact from it. And a lot of them have been at a loss for it. To do that. And the second question here, which is the more important one to me, is it still relevant? In 2015, given the change in the environment in which we work, is it still relevant? And I'm not so sure that it is, because I don't think this is how we do things like this anymore. And I'll tell you why I say that. If I look at how we buy everything else, or we judge the quality of everything else, it's much more through less formal, more crowd-oriented means. We talk to our friends. We find out what they like or don't like. We go to things like Yelp or TripAdvisor or where I make dinner reservations. OpenTable. And we read what other customers of the same restaurant products have to say about it. We basically look for thumbs up or thumbs down in some form from a community whose opinions we respect, as opposed to an unfettered, unknown mass. And my question is, if this works for everything else we do, is there a way that the same approach could work for learning? And so I ask the following question, and this is hypothetical because I haven't seen this exactly before, but it's sort of to get you thinking about it. If we created a model in which you got to, at the end of a learning experience, rate 4 different things in a very quick way, in the same way that you might enter something into any of the other sort of crowd-generated evaluation models that I mentioned a moment ago. You rate the format. So was the format of the training or the learning experience appropriate given the content? Pretty simple answer. Did it meet my expectations? Did I get what I thought I was going to get based on the things I read about it and the needs that I had? Is there utility? Can I go do something because of it? Is there a task I can perform? Is there a problem I can solve? Is there a deliverable I can create that is better because I participated in this experience? And finally, what was the overall value of it? And then I might provide comments. And so I'm going to ask now a series of poll questions to get at whether or not you think that this kind of approach might be a better way to go about evaluating the impact and effectiveness of learning from an organizational perspective in addition to an individual perspective than what Kirkpatrick laid out in 1994 and sort of tried to execute the next 30 years. So let's go back to the poll. So remember, format, expectations, utility, and value, and then comments. So my question is, would this approach work for these different types of learning? And you can just check the ones that you think it would work for. So if you think some kind of approach like that would work for classroom training, e-learning, informal learning, or other learning resources, just give it a check. Now, while this is going on, someone made a comment which is pretty interesting, which is that a lot of people don't finish e-learning courses. And that is for sure an issue, and one of the questions that we might ask is, do they not finish them because they don't get good measures on those four items, or are we getting more comfortable with just in time, where you just do as much as you need to solve the problem you have, and then that means might you rate the same product many times as you went in and out? So we've got a good number of responses, and I'll skip the results, and the answer is, at this point, the bottom two are more challenging. Classroom and e-learning, overwhelmingly yes. Informal and other learning resources, a little more challenging. And let me tell you what I mean by informal learning and other learning resources to see if this might change it. But informal learning is more things like mentoring or Google Groups or a LinkedIn group or whatever other networks and things that you participate in. And the fourth one, other learning resources, are things like web resources, like PDF files or books or websites or things like that. But I think that most of the learning that we offer in a formal way is classroom and e-learning, so we're kind of interested there. Second question. How would you rate the complexity of that model? 4 different things, which of course I can't read now because they're too small. That's okay, I'm good with that. So do you think the model, the 4 ratings plus a comments box, is too simple, too complex, or about right? Okay, you're thinking about this. That's a good sign. And based on your responses to this point, we can go to results on this one. We're close to 100 responses. I'd say almost 70% thought it was about right. A few thought it was too simple. A few thought it was too complex. And one of the questions is, if you chose too simple or too complex, could you write a comment in about what made you think that? Someone made a comment that utility is the key. What that gets to is the idea that how well you do it may be more important than just being able to perform it. So to the extent to which you can somehow judge whether or not it increased your ability to do something well is an important factor to consider here. So next question. And this gets really down to the basics. Would you do this if it was presented to you? If you got a little assessment tool at the end of a learning experience that asked you those 4 questions, would you do it? So we're getting tired now. So we're slowing down with the responses, but that's okay. It's late. We're up to about almost up to 100. It's about 85 anyway. So we'll have a look here. Overwhelmingly, you said yes. And 2 people have asked a very interesting question, which I'm going to come to in a moment. But you know what? I did a bad thing. Okay. I didn't mean to go to the next question so quickly, but there we go. So finally, if this were available, would you use it? And once again, and we're seeing overwhelming responses that most of you would in fact complete the survey, and then overwhelmingly you said you'd use it. Now I want to pause for one moment and respond to a question that a couple of people have raised online, which is, will this satisfy an organization's increasing desire to test ROI? And that relates to another question, would this be translatable into return on investment? And the answer is directly no. But here's what's changed, I think, lately. It may be that in traditional organizations where learning and development initiatives are directed from a centralized or a business unit training function, and they're investing large amounts of money in a single large intervention, then this kind of information could be used for collecting data from the people involved in it, but you would still have to look at what business results were achieved and did that make the investment worthwhile. So this helps contribute to an ROI study, but not necessarily, it's necessary maybe, but not sufficient. The flip side is a lot of learning that happens in organizations now is user-generated. It's you taking control of your own learning needs and going off and doing things yourself. The organization doesn't necessarily see it, but for you to be able to show data that says, I spent my time on this, and overwhelmingly everyone else who spent time on it thinks they got real value from it, I think increasingly, I say it differently, I'll say it in a slightly more negative way. Organizations that ignore that kind of data do it at their own peril. Because if they don't trust your judgment about whether or not something is of value to you, then I think that will lead to a lot of other issues that will be hard to solve. So a few more questions. So one of the questions is, which I think is a really interesting point, is that should we begin collecting data for people when they leave training early about why they left? So to find out whether or not it's because they didn't like it or because they got what they needed out of it and they had to go do something different. And I think that would be a very interesting thing to learn. How do we get more people to complete the survey? I have seen organizations withhold things. So you want your certificate, which a lot of us care about, or you want your badge, or you want the reward you get from completion. This is part of it. And I've seen that work in some contexts. There's a lot of work to do about how you operationalize this in different situations and different functions, and I think my goal is to sort of get it out there as an option that might get us more value than the more traditional Kirkpatrick model might get us. Then finally, how would you rate the value of this approach in general? Just sort of think back about what it looks like and how it might work. Overall, do you think this would yield positive benefits in an organization or individually? We're up to 50, try and get to 80. So if you haven't responded, give it a shot. Move ahead. And I think it's remarkably close. Oops. The answer is medium value just under half, and high value just below that. Not many of you thought there'd be low value, and so the question you have to ask yourself at some point is the effort required to execute on something like this worth the value it could deliver? And I think the answer based on this is probably it could be if we made it simple. So with that, a couple things as we conclude here. The first is traditional learning measuring methodologies for measuring impact an old world concept? Is it too centrally driven? In the new world, is it really about individual performance? If a lot of people do independent learning intervention, take training, and their performance gets better, they deliver more, they do it better, they get it done quickly, they deliver results to the organization, is that really the analog to ROI? And can that become something that has more meaning than what could be a somewhat, and there's a lot of controversy over whether or not it can even do ROI of learning. So I'm not convinced yet that we really know the answer to that question. And so a few final thoughts, and then we have time for a few more questions. Number one, I think it's time for something new. I think that as good as the Kirkpatrick model was, and as brilliant a man as he was, and as much as he contributed to the field of learning and development, I think that we may have moved beyond what that approach can deliver in all contexts. The second thing is it seems like a more community-based model like Yelp or OpenTable or LinkedIn or Facebook or other places where your peers rate the quality of products, maybe something more community-based would make more sense. The third thing, and this is a concern to me even on those types of rating systems, I have to be able to trust the responses. When I look at the star system and I see everybody gives it 5 stars, I get nervous. On the other hand, when I look at hotel ratings, I'm overly influenced by the negative ratings. When I see something that averages 4.3 and then I read 3 awful reviews, I tend to believe them. So I have to figure out how we develop trust in the data in a way that makes sense to us. And finally, we have to do something, because right now I feel like we're kind of missing the boat in this whole area. I've time for a couple more questions, but I have a couple in the queue here. So one of the questions is, a very interesting question is, given what I said earlier about the forgetting curve, would it be useful to measure, to fill out, in essence, that quick evaluation over time to see if the further you leave, the further distance between you and the learning experience, your ratings would change? And I think that's a fascinating question. I don't know the answer, but one that might be worth evaluating. A question someone asked, how does Smarter fit into this approach? That's the last question. That's a great question. I think that part of my job at this company, at Smarter, is to look at the learning and development universe in a larger context. I don't know that Smarter's product directly addresses this, other than to allow people to test themselves on a fairly frequent basis, and to be able to test and retest to make sure you do in fact have skill. But this is more of a thought piece about the state of learning evaluation in business. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Lindsay. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. Lindsay?
Thank you, Larry. That is all the time we have today. Thank you to everyone for attending and for your participation in Larry's questioning and polls. If you have any comments or feedback, you're welcome to email us at webinars@pluralsight.com. This webinar was recorded, and we'll email the link in a few days. Remember to tweet about your experience today for a chance to win a free month of training from Pluralsight with our hashtag PluralsightLive. And remember, when you leave, please fill out our survey. Thank you again, and have a great day.